Okay, this is session 8, and we're talking about pattern and harmony and variety. And pattern is something that takes something that's very simple, and by multiplying it, creating something that can be very complex. So pattern basically starts with the idea of a repetitive understanding, a repetitive line, a repetitive point, and then structurally that is compounded and multiplied across the design surface. Pattern is one of the oldest forms of decor, and it is basically fully cross-cultural. Every culture has signature stylings of pattern throughout, and become known for certain pattern types. And some of the patterns are fairly simple, some are incredibly complex, but they all share one thing in common, and that is the understanding of a structural basis. And the idea of pattern is that the entirety of the pattern is greater than the individual parts within the pattern. It's very similar to the idea of Gestalt. Pattern is totally unified in a variety of ways, and for a pattern to be unified, a lot of things do come into play, but we recognize the totality of the piece before we start breaking down the parts. And even as we're looking at this pattern, there's several different ideas that are going on. We've got the red crisscross, we've got the blue circles, we've got the grays in between, and so forth. And there's a uniformity side to side, top to bottom, and you can recognize the regularity, the orderliness, and so forth in this concept. So pattern is something that by nature represents the idea of unity. Pattern can be created by anything that repeats or recurs across a design field. And because of the repetition or the recurrence, the harmony is established. And as we look at this striped pattern, we notice that the stripes are going vertically, and we also notice that some appear to be thicker and some appear to be thinner as we move across the design space. And there's a sequencing. We go from here all the way over to about here, and then we start all over again. So pattern repeats, not just repeated elements, but patterns can repeat patterns within them. So there's a lot of complexity and sublayers that can happen. Pattern can be as simple as a polka dot or a checkerboard or just black and white stripes, and it can be as complex as a lot of the grunge ornament that we see nowadays, especially in graphic design and on apparel and t-shirts and things like that. So unity, as we talked about last time, is the totality of the design. Everything's working together to express the whole. Unity is the Gestalt, it's the whole thing. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we recognize pattern as the entire thing, the whole thing first. So pattern, we automatically recognize the Gestalt, it's automatically unified. Harmony is the manner in which the individual parts work together to unify. And harmony is basically the idea of an established order, and things follow within that order. And so I've already mentioned that there's a sequencing of stripes in terms of color. We go kind of from more muted into brighter, and then we start back into more muted again, and we keep going, and with that pattern within a pattern idea. The way in which this pattern its elements are working together is that there is common verticality in terms of direction. There is that sequence. We go to here, and then we begin again and go to here, and then we begin again and go to here, and so forth. Also, the colors work together. There's nothing that really stands out as being odd or wrong. There are colors, the yellow-green, that is creating an accent at various points throughout, but everything is kind of in the red-violet, either tinted, shaded, toned, or neutralized, and a couple brighter elements in the yellow-green going on. So it is harmonizing by virtue of color, it's harmonizing by virtue of common direction, and it's harmonizing by virtue of just the repeated pattern that's happening within the pattern, the sequence that's going on. Very often when you have a straight up pattern that is the same from top to bottom, side to side, such as the first one, we look at it and we go, okay, it's a nice pattern, it creates a background, and we can put things in front of it or on top of it. And there's really, once we address this and we understand what's going on in it visually, it becomes, okay, we've been there, we've done that, what's next? So there's a sense of not quite boredom, but monotony is a better word. And but if we look at this, there's a little less monotony because of that pattern within the pattern sequence. And so there's a change-up happening. There's points of accent. It's not exactly the same side to side, top to bottom. There's some little high points here and there that catch the eye and make the whole thing interesting. Variety is the idea that if harmony is an established order, but too much of it can be monotonous and staid, S-T-A-I-D, variety then works within that established order to create points of difference that lend visual interest. So in this pattern, for instance, we have the background kind of mottled browns going on. We have the yellow-green curly-Q thingies, and then we have the blue flowers. And notice that there seems to be a lot of looseness to the idea here. We have different number of petals on the flowers. We have some larger scale and some a lot smaller. We have the yellow-green curlicues kind of wrapping around, and then there are kind of thinner ones behind which are a little more faint. And notice the spatial depth that appears to be happening in this pattern by virtue of size relationships, pushing and pulling, value relationships. And so there's a lot more stuff going on, but it's still harmonizing, it's still unified, and it is still a pattern. Most man-made patterns tend toward regularity. There is a real strong expected order, a sequence, a method, a cadence, and so forth. And this is a tile pattern, and obviously you can see that, as we've discussed previously, it's an active structure, it's a formal structure, it's a monochromatic color scheme, and it's regular. It's, point A to point B, it's the same thing. And no surprises, no change-ups within the design or anything like that. And this actually is when we think of pattern, this is mostly the way we think of it, that there is a real solid regularity to the idea. There are, however, irregular patterns, and they are created visually in the same way. There is an occurrence, a repeated occurrence of elements, and they spread across the design space, but they seem to be more informally structured, and different things happen in them, and we find those a lot in nature. This is a pattern, and obviously there are larger shapes and there are smaller shapes, and there are larger intervals and smaller intervals, but the whole thing is a repeat of the dark color, the light color, the dark color, the light color, and so forth. And it is not regular, but it is anticipated. There is a looseness to it. It almost appears to be random, but it's really not. And it is obviously useful for the animal, but this is what we call an irregular pattern, something that's a little more fluid, much more organic in feel, versus something that is much more rigid. One of the things about pattern, no matter whether it's regular or irregular, there is a strong sense of order to it. Obviously, this would seem more orderly than this. But the idea of it goes all the way back to our first project when we were addressing the idea of order and chaos. And we talked about how order is an established occurrence, a sequence, a method, something that's planned, and that we prefer orderly things. We enjoy variety, but we still look to order and balance and excellence and things like that. So we've been basically dealing with the underlying ideas of pattern all the way through this quarter, and we'll continue to deal with them. Pattern has made a resurgence in popularity probably over the last almost decade now, with the revitalization of ornament and patterned visual fields and things like that in a variety of design disciplines. And we see in those disciplines not just an orderly pattern such as this, but we see also a distressing, what we call grunge or a gritty, kind of a dirty understanding, sort of street pattern, on the streets, so to speak. And the last time we had that occurrence was back in the 60s with the kind of the influence of Art Nouveau and so forth, and arts and crafts into a lot of what was going on in 60s design. And so we are now still experiencing the background pattern, the background motif, and things like that. This is actually from the secessionist era, right at the end of the Art Nouveau era. And so it still has some Art Nouveau sensibility, but notice the pattern and the all-over contrast of that, the complexity of that, with the more simple, lighter areas in the middle, and the eye goes right there. And this is a loosely contrived, irregular, informal pattern, but it's still a pattern recognized by light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark repetition. So every time we see light, dark across a surface or across our field of vision, we are seeing pattern. In this Jasper Johns, we have kind of a sense of surface texture in this pattern. This is actually a painting that is broken up structurally into rectangular modules, and within most of the modules is a numeral of one sort or another, and it's painted in caustic, which is a really thick paint that's got some wax in it. And so if you were actually to touch this painting, or, well, you couldn't touch it if you saw it hanging on the wall in a museum, but you could go up and look at it and notice how the light hits it and recognize the physical texture, the surface quality of the painting itself. But as we're looking at it here, we don't get the physical concept. We can't touch it. We can't see it and see the light and shadow falling on the various ridges and valleys that the paint would actually make on the surface. What we're seeing is a visual texture. Pattern, and the way it repeats, gives a nod toward the idea of surface and the sense of roughness or smoothness one way or the other. So whenever we have pattern, there is most of the time going to be a connection to a tactile sensation, a sense of touch. So we're going to look at this Jasper Johns piece and go, that looks pretty rough. And the roughness is by virtue of how the space is broken up structurally, how the color is applied, and the all-over kind of mottled texture that's going on. Warhol, who was part of the 60s movement and so forth, created pattern through repeated images. And obviously in this, we have a different kind of pattern sense, different kind of textural sense, and just the repetition of, first of all, the rectangles going side to side and top to bottom. It's almost a checkerboard, but not quite in terms of it's not square, it's rectangular. And then the repeated portraits of the subject going all the way through. And the regularity is more with the structural understanding. It is an active structure, and color is applied within those rectangles, but then the portraits themselves are doing different things. That's where the variety is. That's where the actual texture starts coming in. When you have a pattern that is broken up in large shapes or large bits of color area or contrasted by value, you're going to start losing a sense of texture, a sense of surface, because then we can start seeing panel A, panel B, panel 22 and so forth, and it takes additional distance to make it small enough to fuse into a pattern. Whereas something like this, we will automatically fuse because the little areas of color actually break up the space a lot more. There's a lot more clutter going on in here than what we've got going on in here. This, however, has a greater contrast of value throughout. It's a lot lighter and it's a lot darker over the entire surface than this is. This is mostly midtones and lighter values. A pattern like this is a repeat pattern, but the change-ups are so small and so close together that the whole thing fuses into that kind of grayish color field. And this happens a lot with textiles. It'll happen a lot with floor coverings, anything that's woven. A tight weave like this, the sense of small elements with very minimal amount of interval, negative space between them, is going to do that optical fusion thing that we kind of looked at the panel 4 in your figure ground project, where things sort of fuse together and become a different color. So here we have some red and some black and going on, and there's also a little bit of white. So this is now fusing optically into a toned red, a red that has both black and white. And so when we look at this, we can easily put things on top of it, in front of it, without having to worry about the pattern competing with what we're putting in front of it. Where if we had something like this, this is actually what we call a showcase piece and would overwhelm a variety of furniture pieces and so forth that we would put in front of it. So when you're dealing with pattern issues, it's very important to understand how patterns work together. The scale of the elements in the pattern is very important to understand. Large scale elements within a pattern do different things visually than small scale things. So this is a very different sensibility than this. Here we see pattern as backdrop. The repetitive linear elements are also fading up the wall into whiteness, and it becomes then a backdrop for the warmer neutralized tones of the furniture and the flooring. Most of the time in interior spaces, pattern is going to end up being background. If it's calling attention to itself and you've got a lot going on in the space, it's going to add visual clutter. It's going to add a sense of energy and movement to the room, and the room will not necessarily be relaxing. So pattern needs to be dealt with judiciously and intelligently so that it serves the space that you're designing. It serves the function of that space. We talked about unity being the gestalt, being the entirety of any design, and everything working together within the design is the idea of harmony. And variations are on that harmony, that order, are the idea of variety. And variety is what lends interest. So we look at this poster for a stage production of Beauty and the Beast. We notice certain issues happening. It has a balanced color scheme. It's a secondary triad of orange, violet, and green. We have a variety of background textures and patterns that are basically the stage for Beauty to stand on, and then Beast is directly framing her, behind her. And so we have, of course, value contrast going on. There is a nod to Art Nouveau and actually more secessionist sensibility right back in here in terms of the background pattern behind the Beast. We notice a nod to Klimt down in here. Gustav Klimt was kind of known for kind of flat pattern with what appear to be floral elements, so there's an influence there. And Klimt, of course, was a secessionist. And then we notice that there is a lot of pattern, a lot of textural understanding in the side panels and even behind the figures in the center panel. And by virtue of color, by virtue of direction, everything is working together. There's nothing here that seems out of place or strange or wrong. And everything harmonizes, but there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of things to captivate the eye in this, which is really nice. One of the things that also harmonizes is the use of curves within the piece. The implied curve here, the implied line curve first of all, and then we have the curve of her figure and the draping on her gown, and then we have that kind of echoed and picked up in the Beast, and then he kind of frames her, wraps around her, and curves back down. So there's a lot of repeated complementary curvature in this piece. This also should kind of remind you of the first project where we address the issues of order and chaos via surface pattern. This is a little more illustrative than that project parameter, but you can see that harmony is established in the orderly pattern of the chain linking, and then we have variety. It's all related. The whole thing is in black and white. The whole thing is pretty much linear except for the bottom color bar, which is gray. And there are basically little detail areas where this is breaking apart, where the barbed wire area is kind of breaking, and so forth. So this whole thing harmonizes, but there's enough variety to give it interest, so we don't just look at it and leave. We actually stay in the design space for a little bit looking at it. In this, we notice that there are tons of circles and a lot of curved lines, and there seems to be a random structure that's going on, and the structure seems a little bit active and a lot active in terms of how the circles are placed and things. But look at all the repeated smaller areas of color that create pattern, and how that pattern seems to texturize the design surface. It looks like it's beaded or it's rough in some way. And it's just really fascinating how those small areas of color with their little bits of negative space in between, and then we have the gutters of the circles, and we pick up that pattern again. It really creates a tactile sensibility, like you want to reach out and touch and feel it, which is kind of cool. What harmonizes here, of course, are the repetitive curves, the concentric circles, the repetition of the color from one side to the other, and of course the order to it, and the variety, of course, is also within the color fields, just the placement of things, the fact that we kind of center around the darker circular areas and then move out toward the edges. In this, pattern is used in a very architectural way, as it represents the kind of fantasy buildings that are going on. We see pattern kind of depicting brickwork, and basically describing and embellishing the architectural elements. Notice the windows are also echoing the smaller patterns in this. We've got the linear patterns which echo the outside edges, the curve that's going on there. And we've got change up of pattern down here and a change up of pattern over here. And then we have the patterning that's much more random in the night sky. So we've got a very regular pattern, approximately symmetrical balance. And then we have the pattern of the stars scattered across the sky, which creates a different density and a different understanding of pattern. It's a lot more irregular. What else harmonizes here is the fact that it's a monochromatic image. It is one hue, monochroma, one color, one hue. And so it's red, here represented by pink, and then the gray, which is the achromatic. When we are creating harmony and creating variety to go with it, to make things interesting, one of the ways that we can make that harmony-variety relationship is through how things are distributed across the page or across the design space. Things are either going to be concentrated or densely populated in one area, or they're going to be scattered widely or dispersed. So there's a contrast between the idea of concentration and dispersion. They are exclusive. One does not necessarily require the other, but put together you can really see the contrast. So we see in this drawing, first of all, it harmonizes. There's a lot of verticality in the linear elements that are in this. It is also achromatic. It is only black and white and a sense of gray. And notice that the house in the center is designated because there's more density or more concentration. And then we see the trees, and then there's this pathway leading up to the house that is dispersed. Things are scattered. There's a lot more negative space between the little elements here than there is here. So by virtue of density versus dispersion, or lack of density, sparseness is probably the word I'm looking for, we get a sense of what this illustration is depicting. Here is also a sense of variety through distribution and change up in pattern. It's a book cover, obviously, from early 20th century, and it's one of those really textural book covers that actually is stamped, and it has highs and lows in it. So it's really a piece of architecture, and really a lovely environment to just hold in your lap or whatever and read. Obviously, the things that harmonize here are the color, the level of value contrast that's going on, and the diagonals that are picked up in several places. There's some curves, there's some circular elements, there's some figurative elements, there's some background pattern, and so forth. There's a lot of different patterns that are going on in here, and they're all working within the same space. There's really not one of them that seems really awkward. And the variety that is going on in here is kind of going on section by section. One thing seems to lead in visually to another. So there's a lot of variety going on in this. One of the things about variety is that if that's all you have something that is very cluttered, and too much variety can create disunity. If everything is different in a design space, you don't really have unity, and you really have to force unity to happen. In this window treatment, this is the the storefront office of a designer. uh, she's applied little appliques to the window that look like drops of water. And so we have variety in the intervals, the negative space between, and we have variety in the color. We have unity in that they are all kind of going in the same direction and they're all the same scale. In this poster, there's the idea of concentration, there's the idea of dispersion. Concentration is where things are densely populated, and then as we moved out toward the edges, things become scattered and wider spread, so we have more negative space showing up, and in here we have very little negative space. This stands out quite a bit, and by virtue, if you recall the Gestalt principle of similarity, things that are similar will unite, allowing things to stand out to become focal points. Things that are different will become points of emphasis and points of visual interest within a design space. Here's the idea of dispersion. We don't need dispersion to understand concentration. We don't need concentration to understand dispersion. So this is dispersion. Things are scattered. There's a lot of negative space between these elements, and there's nothing concentrated, but we just recognize the broadness of the scattering and the lack of density of the relationships in this piece.